Namaskar and a hearty welcome to everybody for this morning's meeting. In today's talk, I'd like to say a few words on Sri Ramakrishna's special message, his special message for our times. Some of you may know that Holy Mother, Sri Sharada Devi, she observed more than once that renunciation is the central theme of Sri Ramakrishna's life and teaching. Renunciation of lust, greed, and egotism. This threefold renunciation is what Sri Ramakrishna stressed most. Once a disciple of Holy Mother asked her, "Mother, wasn't it in order to demonstrate the harmony of religions that Sri Ramakrishna came this time?" And Mother says, "Do you know, my child, I never felt that the Master practiced the different religions with the intention, with the conscious motive of teaching their harmony. He was always immersed in God consciousness, and he followed the disciplines of different religions to realize God in different ways, in order to enjoy the bliss of God in different ways. But you know, this time, in this incarnation, renunciation has been his specialty. Has anyone ever seen this kind of spontaneous renunciation? What you said about the harmony of religions is, of course, true. In other incarnations, other ideals were emphasized, but this time, especially, he has shown the ideal of renunciation." Then she adds, "It is quite natural for people to forget God. So whenever the need arises, God himself incarnates on earth and shows the path himself by practicing spiritual disciplines." So Mother says, it is quite natural that people forget God. Sri Ramakrishna used to find it very strange that people suffer so much in the world but still don't come to their senses. The whole world is so bound by desire. We make money and enjoyment the goal of our lives and come to grief in the end. By too much attachment to this false world, we get so involved in that and create no end of misery for ourselves. Sometimes we feel that some people even seem to thrive on this kind of suffering and misery. Sri Ramakrishna used to compare them to a camel. The camel eats thorny leaves and bleeds in its mouth, but it keeps eating them all the same. But we here, we here are spiritual aspirants, and we can't live like that. We have fixed for ourselves a higher goal, and we can't afford to lose ourselves in this world. So we have to think deeply about renunciation and detachment. Let us ask ourselves, why did Sri Ramakrishna lay so much stress on renunciation? His answer is simple. Because God can't be seen. Without renunciation, there can be no spiritual life. And renunciation means not only outward renunciation, but also mental renunciation. The renunciation Sri Ramakrishna had in mind is, in fact, more mental than outward. Sooner or later, one has to give up one's attachment even to one's own body and mind, and of course, also to those of others. One has to become truly dispassionate, detached in every way. It's not enough to be unattached to some things, to some people, and remain attached to others. Because it is easier to give up what one doesn't like and think it is renunciation. But true renunciation is a change of attitude. It's a change of attitude towards everything, towards everybody. So, why is renunciation necessary? Why should we practice so much dispassion and non-attachment? Because spiritual disciplines can't be successfully practiced without giving up all old associations which are not helpful to us. We can live a truly spiritual life and we can make progress only to the extent that we are prepared to give up our desires and passions, our attachments and aversions. We must be always alert, never to let our mind cheat us on this point. The mind always brings up some reason or other that we can't give up this thing or that it is our duty to feel concerned about this person or that. But we must be careful because the mind is most of the time the spokesman of our own hidden desires and motives. That is why we need not only spiritual disciplines like prayer and meditation, but also renunciation. In fact, prayer and meditation are only effective in proportion to our renunciation and detachment. This is something very important. When these two, spiritual disciplines on the one hand and renunciation on the other, when these two are combined, then it becomes possible for us to control the mind and purify it. Now, whatever we like attracts our mind and creates bondage. This we know, but though we don't always readily accept that. But love can also lead to hatred. Attachment can lead to aversion. There are only two sides of the same coin. The same thing turned upside down. They're not essentially different. This is what I'm trying to say. This many of us know from personal experience. So we must try to get rid of all forms of bondage and fear by becoming dispassionate, by becoming free. How do we become dispassionate? By becoming free from our own likes and dislikes. We should never have any personal claim on anybody, nor should we allow anybody to have any personal claim on us. That's also equally important. Nobody owns anything in this world. It is God's word. Nothing, whatever, is anybody's property. If we possess anything, we only possess it as trustees and never as owners. Our only duty is to administer or serve in God's name. Even Holy Mother said, serve others, but love God alone. Love must be given to God alone. As spiritual aspirants, we must love God alone. And allow others also to do that, to do the same. Because if we love other people more than God, or let others allow us more than they love God, then neither of us will be worthy of God. That way we will never succeed in spiritual life. We reap what we sow. As long as we keep binding ourselves and others with our likes and dislikes, we will remain bond slaves. We will continue to bring misery upon ourselves and upon others. Misery is the penalty we pay for all our attachments. The result may come sooner or later, but eventually all will have to pay for their folly. But let us not get discouraged. I said we here are spiritual aspirants. And Sri Ramakrishna said, the case of spiritual aspirants is different. Devotees of God, we belong to one another. Because we are all bound by the common bond of God's love, which is pure and permanent. Love for one's spiritual brothers and sisters. That love is certainly deeper than worldly love. And it is surely beneficial. That is the relationship we see among the disciples of Jesus Christ and Sri Ramakrishna. What deep love, what mutual respect and consideration existed between them. Only that kind of spiritual love is genuine because it is utterly pure and utterly unselfish. The so-called love of worldly people, as we all know too well, it is very often only polished self-interest. But now comes the surprise. It is these spiritual people like the disciples, the great souls, people like the disciples of Jesus and Sri Ramakrishna, whom I mentioned just now. It is whose love is so pure and so unselfish. It is these people who teach us renunciation and detachment. That means renunciation and detachment is not indifference. It is not a lack of consideration for others. That is nothing but callousness. And callousness is not non-attachment. It is nothing but selfishness. It is nothing but holding to one's own selfish ego. What the great souls intend to teach us is that we should try to serve others as best as we can, but without getting attached to them. But if we feel in our present state of development, if we feel that we can't do that, we can't even serve others without getting too involved in their lives, if we feel that we might be weakening or jeopardizing our own spiritual aspirations, then let us pray to God for their welfare. If we are sincere, and if our prayers are intense, we are sure to find help reaching them. But to be able to pray, of course, we should all feel ourselves close to God. So love of God, in any way, love of God has to come first before we get down to helping others. When we first turn from worldly life to spiritual life, we may feel a little indifferent towards others. This is natural, but this is only a period of transition. It is only for the time being. If we stick to the ideal of God realization, and if we lead a pure life side by side, we will see our old love returning in a purified, elevated form. Then we love others not out of any superficial attraction, not out of any selfish motive, but because we'll be able to feel God's presence in them. We'll be able to see ourselves and others as God's children. That alone is real love. If you come to think of it, after all, who are our true friends and relatives? It's only spiritual people, devotees of God. Very often, the people we think are our near and dear ones, they turn out to be perfect strangers. They live on one thought plane, and we on an entirely different thought plane. So, if we are eager to progress quickly in spiritual life, sometimes it does become necessary to live like strangers among our own people. And if they try to drag us down with their compulsions, if they try to drag us down, the only way sometimes is to part company. If we want to move on and they want us to lie down, I'm afraid, what else can we do? So we need to develop a more realistic perspective, spiritually speaking, a more realistic perspective with regard to our own family and friends. We need to free the mind from all old associations because they are mostly connected with purely human emotions and sentiments. If we really want to become spiritual, then we have to cultivate the spiritual perspective. And the best way of doing this is by thinking of the impersonal spirit more and more. The thought of the divine spirit dwelling in all beings, that thought will loosen our clinging to human forms. But we must think this thought so intensely that it becomes a reality to us. Then it will sustain us when all our other ideas, rosy ideas of other people, are broken. Otherwise, when we are disappointed with our family or friends, we become angry, we become bitter. And hatred, as you know, is as bad as love. Aversion is as bad as attachment. It is not that one is better than the other. Both create bondage, both degrade us, and both prevent us from rising to our true stature. So, both have to be renounced. Why do we become angry? Only because somebody didn't meet our expectations. Or because there could be one more reason, because something is standing in our way of enjoyment. Either somebody fails to measure up to our expectations, or something is standing as an obstacle on our way to enjoyment. In the last analysis, this is the only reason for all our anger. And anger is closely connected with an overstressed ego. Without a very strong sense of ego, without an excessive desire for enjoyment, anger could never rise in our hearts. If we don't desire any enjoyment, if we don't expect any worldly favor from anybody, we can never be angry. Desire and anger, as Krishna says in the Gita, desire and anger are the two greatest enemies on our path, and without eliminating them, it is impossible to progress in spiritual life. So, wherever there is anger, there is some attachment with a hope of enjoyment. It may not be any gross form of enjoyment. These things have to be understood more in a subtle sense. Maybe an expectation of praise or a hope of becoming popular or to be important. These things. Still, gross or subtle, it is only our own frustrated will to enjoy that gives rise to anger. Sometimes, especially in the early stages of our spiritual life, we become easily irritable, we become short-tempered. That is because, we can see it in ourselves, that is because our renunciation is still half-hearted. Outer renunciation is not always followed by a corresponding inner detachment. Then what happens? The inner attachment conflicts with the outer renunciation, and that creates discord in the personality. So, true renunciation must be renunciation of attachment and aversion. So, we see that in the beginning, spiritual practice itself produces both good and bad results. When we water a garden well, we get not only fine flowers but also plenty of weeds. So we have to do a lot of weeding, cutting, chopping, uprooting, burning. This renunciation and detachment is in fact nothing but a continual process of clearing the jungle within. I'm only talking to you as one spiritual aspirant to other aspirants. All of us here have a little fire of renunciation burning in our heart, at least sometimes. But then we dump the rubbish of worldliness on it, and the little fire dies out. Our love for the world kills the little flame of love of God that we already have. The flame of renunciation, the flame of divine love, this has to be always kept alive. It needs constant care. Otherwise, the bad associations, our old outgoing mental tendencies, these things will extinguish that flame. Sri Ramakrishna used to say, it is like protecting a tender young plant by raising a hedge around it. Otherwise, it will be eaten up by stray cattle, and it will never grow up into a big, sturdy, unshakable tree. In the same way, when we sacrifice, when we let go of all our personal relations and attachments, the little flame of renunciation, that little flame will grow into a raging fire and destroy all worldliness. This is what renunciation does. Renunciation, by destroying our attachments, renunciation makes us fearless. And renunciation, most importantly, it sets us free. But all this, however, all this is one part of the story. According to Sri Ramakrishna, renunciation and detachment have to go hand in hand with love of God. Without love of God, or without intense devotion to one's spiritual ideal, spiritual life becomes dry and difficult. But when renunciation is accompanied by love of God, spiritual life becomes a most joyful journey because divine love fulfills everything. In this sense, for a lover of God, there is no sacrifice, no giving up as such, but only fulfillment, because this pure divine love finds expression in love for all in general, love without any reservations, without being limited to particular individuals. That is why I said renunciation is something liberating. We don't have to be afraid of it. If we can develop this new outlook, our life will change altogether. Because renunciation breaks down all barriers, bursts all bonds. Then we will become channels for the free flow of divine energy. So, let us make room for God in our hearts. True renunciation, in its positive aspect, means filling the heart with God. Generally, it is burdened with desires and passions, but to the extent we are able to get rid of this worldly burden, to that extent we feel more of the divine presence within. If we are able to shift our center of consciousness from the ego to God, then we will find that everything has a place in God. So, it is only God and God alone who can give permanent happiness to our soul. He is the one source of all happiness. But the irony is, though He lives right here within our own heart as the soul of our soul, we somehow manage to ignore Him and run after external objects. It is like ignoring the real thing and running after reflections and shadows. Really, as a matter of fact, we are living on desires and false hopes, which bring only misery, bondage, and slavery, because they are dependent on other things, on other people. Sarvam paravasham dukkham. This is what the great Buddha said. If we give up those false hopes, worldly hopes, we are sure to be happy. Our only hope should be connected with God, centered on Him, dependent on Him alone. All other hopes connected with our desires, with our urges, should be given up. So let us not hope for anything worldly. Let us hope only for God and His grace. That is the first sign of true dispassion for the world. The very first sign. Without this basic quality of dispassion, spiritual life can't even begin. And that is not enough. That should become our dominant trait if we want to become really spiritual. So the spirit of renunciation has to be there. It may not come to us suddenly or dramatically like we find in the lives of great saints and mystics. But we must not be so foolish as to wait until all our desires are satisfied. That is never going to happen. Desires and impulses keep rising within endlessly, owing to our tendencies, our own past experiences, what we call samskaras, vasanas, patterns and habits of thought. That is the very nature of desire, to keep multiplying and never to be satisfied. But that is no reason why we should feel helpless against them. Because we can and must put them down. Of course, it may all take time and mean great strain and inner conflict for some period. We have to struggle very hard at self-control, but that is unavoidable. That is the minimum required to start the spiritual life. This early phase has to be passed through by every aspirant. There is no bypassing it. But the sooner we start our spiritual life, the better. When we really start practicing true renunciation, inside and out, then we will realize what sort of wretched life we were living until then. When we realize our mistake in life, the first reaction that we feel for our worldliness is disgust. Please don't misunderstand me. Disgust not for the world. I only said disgust for our own worldliness. It's a strong expression, I know, but that is what happens. But then it's a sign of a radical transformation, a definite turn from the worldly life to the spiritual. If we have that kind of that feeling of disgust, the world will no longer attract us, and nothing in the world will be an obstacle in our way. So renunciation, in addition to making us fearless, it also makes us strong. Even Patanjali says, when one practices absolute purity, one develops revulsion. He's far stronger. One develops revulsion for one's own body and an aversion for coming into contact with other bodies. Shauchat swanga jugupsa parairasam sargah. A revulsion for one's own body and an aversion for coming into contact with other bodies. It's not enough to know these things superficially. Unless we are able to also react emotionally to these things, I mean instinctively, unless we are able to react instinctively, our spiritual life is never safe. But cases of such clear-cut, complete change, they are rare. Most people are only slightly better than the camel of Sri Ramakrishna's parable. Their renunciation is half-hearted, even after getting such heavy blows in life. After a brief fit of renunciation, they get entangled in the world all the more. These are Sri Ramakrishna's words. But why? Why does this happen? The reason is, as I already said, we lack inner detachment. Simply by giving up the world outwardly, we don't become pure in thought, word, and deed, which is what absolute, complete renunciation means. It's easier to give up a bad habit than a bad thought. It's easy to avoid worldly company, but the internal company of our own old thoughts and tendencies, that is far more difficult to shake off. And it is this inner company that is more troublesome and dangerous. Here, prayer and discrimination are our only help. These are also Sri Ramakrishna's words. He always wanted that spiritual aspirants, devotees, should practice both prayer and discrimination. Through ceaseless ceaseless prayer and constant discrimination, we have to detach ourselves from all those old worldly images. We should keep removing old dirt and be careful not to gather fresh dirt. Gradually, we'll find our mind becoming cleaner and stronger. During all these struggles, on both physical and mental levels, we should try to think of God as much as possible. We can do this with the help of prayer. We can do this with the help of japa, repetition of our mantras. We can place before God all the contents of our mind as and when they surface and intensely pray to Him for help. We pray to God to help us get rid of our old impressions and tendencies. In fact, prayer is a powerful means of clearing the subconscious. We don't have to be afraid or ashamed before God. We can offer Him everything. Though this is only possible for those who believe in God, for those who have faith in a personal God. But then there is another alternative. Sometimes it is not possible to prevent a bad thought from rising within. It happens in spite of ourselves. In that case, we could look at it as we look at a mirage. We know the mirage is unreal, but still we do see it. The phenomenon can't be altogether stopped, but it can be seen for what it is, just as a phenomenon. A phenomenon is something that appears to be real, but is actually unreal. If we can keep this in mind, that is also an alternative, a good alternative to prayer. But the best method, however, is to think of ourselves as witnesses or spectators of our own thoughts and feelings, just onlookers of everything that comes up within, however awful, and try to remain aloof and unaffected by them. We can't get rid of a bad impulse, we can't get rid of a bad feeling without first recognizing it and acknowledging its presence. But so what if there are thousands of impure ideas, ugly images lying submerged in my mind? They are still submerged. What is more important is to keep myself unattached to them. It is only when my conscious mind gets connected to them that they really belong to me and begin to bother me. But if I know, one thing is to know that there are undesirable things in the content of my mind. But if I know that in my true nature I am pure, if I know that my real self is always unattached, then I can remain as the witness and be unaffected by such thoughts. And as we become more and more alert, more and more watchful, and practice this kind of non-identification, we'll be able to keep bad thoughts at a safe distance. This higher form of detachment, the interior detachment of myself from everything that doesn't intrinsically belong to it, that is a great help. We need to think more and more of our real nature and stop identifying ourselves with our thoughts, whether they are good or bad. Slowly, this practiced detachment will become natural and spontaneous, and we'll be able to rise above our thoughts and remain as the pure Atman. This is the whole purpose of renunciation, and detachment to restore us to our original pure state. And the purpose of prayer and discrimination, prarthana and viveka. In this context, it is to act as aids to renunciation by rousing our spiritually dull, lazy mind and making it sharp, making it alert through constant struggle. So, these are the four main tools that we have at our disposal: prayer and discrimination, renunciation and detachment, with which we can start working on ourselves. Of course, it involves much work, lots of work, but the tools can't be laid down until we have perfected ourselves. So that is what I wanted to say in this brief talk. There is so much meaning hidden in that little but significant remark of Holy Mothers, that renunciation is Sri Ramakrishna's special message for our times. It is indeed his main teaching for spiritual aspirants like us. So let us pray that the great Master gives us the strength to assimilate this great teaching. Thank you.